Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest ECA Coronavirus Impact Webinar. Joining us today, we have Andrew Eldred, ECA's Director of Employment and Skills, who will bring us up to speed on this week's many developments in the government's COVID-19 strategy. We also have Rob Driscoll with us today, ECA's Director of Legal and Business. Rob will address the key legal, commercial and contractual issues contractors are facing during the coronavirus crisis. Also joining us with a quick update on health and safety guidelines, we have Reeve ECA's Director of CSR and Communications. We'll then have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so all your questions will hopefully be answered then. Before I hand over to Andrew, a couple of housekeeping items. Please note that the Chrome web browser is recommended for the best experience on this platform, and you will see a Q&A box on your screen. Please use this to submit questions for our panel during the session, and do make sure to leave your name. Our panelists will then make sure to try and answer as many as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Thank you once again for joining us today, and over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Omar. Well, what a week it's been. Probably we've had experience of this, I think probably some similar sort of experience back in March, but this probably trumps that in terms of the sheer number of things that have been released, announced and changed, and we're all sort of still trying to work our way through them. So this is our first opportunity to share with you our thoughts on them, and as you've heard, you've got a full house in terms of employee relations, commercial and health and safety. I've called my section Going Back to Work with back in brackets, because of course the reality is quite a lot of people in the industry have continued working. On the other hand, we've also seen very significant numbers of people furloughed over the last few weeks. I would estimate around half, and they are now or will at some point start to go back to work. And we've just got a huge new swathe of rules, guidance and other advice that will be applying to everybody. So for those who are coming back to work, they're going to have to get their heads around it. For those who've been still at work, they're going to have to change what they've been doing, at least to a degree, in respect of what's been announced over the last week. So if we go to the next slide, Omar. I mean, there have been a vast swathe of announcements and publications, principally from the UK government, and we'll be going through some of those during the course of today's webinar. You can see them listed there. I think it's also important to point out that we also need to continue, and probably even more so now, take into account those countries, those parts of the United Kingdom outside of England. It's been one of the sort of main points, I think, to come out of the swathe of information and announcements from the UK government, that actually, although on the one hand Boris Johnson likes to talk about himself speaking on behalf of the UK, in reality a lot of what he's talking about is specific to England. And one of the things that we're going to have to do increasingly is take account of the differences as well as the similarities. We'll talk about the industry response. Obviously ECA is very active in that, and I'll talk about some of the forthcoming guidance that we're putting together at the moment, and then hand over to Rob and then to Paul. Next slide, please, Omar. So, I mean, what is the significance of what's happened this week? In reality, if you look at the details of what's being said, what fundamentally is being said, you could argue that nothing much has changed. As I said, people have continued to work, but I think it's probably fair to say this is a new phase, if only in terms of the shift of focus. And if we look back at the last couple of months, we had that initial phase, didn't we, which is early mid-March, which is all about infection and avoiding infection. There was a lot of public health advice, health and safety issues. in an employee relations context, issues around sick leave, statutory sick pay. We then, with the institution of lockdown in late March, then the attention shifted to furloughing and increasingly further detailed guidance around safety considerations for those who continued to work. All the time, of course, in the background, there are the commercial issues, which have stayed pretty uniform in terms of issues, although obviously there's been progress and developments in terms of trying to accommodate a more balanced approach to commercial relations, which Rob will talk about. Now, we're really, the focus is on the transition back, much more in the way of government measures and guidance to push us in that direction. But as employers, and those who advise employers, we're still at the same time as we're dealing with the return to work. There is still continuation of the infection issues. There will still be people on furlough. And of course, as always, those commercial issues will continue. So it's a more complex, varied pattern and environment that we're dealing with at the moment. And as employers, it's probably the most challenging phase for you, particularly as your business people as well. Next slide. So, I mean, what we're getting here, and of course, this started on Sunday with the broadcast which Boris Johnson gave. A lot of the words on that slide aren't actually very different from what we've been told before. There's always been this distinction, certainly from the UK government. There's always been this distinction between those who can work from home and those who cannot. I think the difference of emphasis, the difference of degree, is what's changed now. And I suppose the one shove that we got, and certainly the one point that really struck me, was that statement that the Prime Minister made and was now repeated in the written guidance, which is sectors of the economy that are allowed to be open should be open. So there's a clear sort of political drive, and of course accompanying that was a lot more activity actively to try and remove the obstacles to going back to work. Hence the government-backed working safely guidelines, which Paul will be talking a lot more about in future, and also other measures that were trailed in the speech, trailed in the accompanying government document around schools, around travel, around expanding testing capabilities, and so on. So that, I would say, it's a political change. It's a kind of a psychological change, really to try and nudge us all in a much more concerted way back to work. Next slide, please, Omar. I'm not going to talk in detail around the working safety guides, because that's really for Paul to do. There's just a list of all the different workplace types, and as electrical contractors, as building services engineering contractors, we'll be working in, not just in construction, we'll probably be working across several of these. There's also vehicles, which is an interesting point, because obviously there's a lot of use of company vehicles, and Paul, I think, will be talking about that later. There are some common themes. Those common themes are captured in that sort of tweet on the right hand side of the slide, but then obviously a lot more detail workplace by workplace. Another important thing about the guide is a wide-ranging stakeholder input and support. This is guidance which is not like the site operating procedures. This has got Public Health England involvement, HSE involvement, widespread employer involvement, and also trade union involvement. And it's had, broadly speaking, public welcoming from the CBI, the TUC, and so on. It kind of gives it a greater authority than what we've had up till now. Next slide, please, Omar. And I mean, Paul will pick up on this much more detail later on, but in terms of the construction guide, there's really a difference of approach on risk assessments, on close proximity working, on face coverings, and some useful guidance on travel. And you'll see the diagram there, which I think is of interest. Might be of more use to civils contractors, you know, transporting a concrete gang than your standard sort of two-seater, three-seater van that we've got, but an indication of the sort of additional granular guidance that we're now being given. Next slide, please, Omar. So moving into my own sort of comfort zone a bit, we had the government or the Prime Minister's broadcast on Sunday. By Tuesday, we had Rishi Sunak standing up in the House of Commons and making the announcement, which had been well trailed ahead of time, which was that furlough was going to be extended. He actually extended it to the end of October, which was actually longer than some people thought he would do. It fits in well with some of the feedback that we as ECA have been feeding through the CLC. In talking to members, I think a lot of the bigger contractors were like the CLC, thinking in terms of the larger projects, thinking about a substantial return to work by sort of June, July. I think for a lot of more medium-sized and smaller firms, the expectation is for a much more longer and more drawn-out return. And certainly feedback we got from members was really indicating that that could extend through to the early autumn. So we do have furlough extended until the end of October. Basically, nothing changes until the 31st of July. So the furlough regime that we're familiar with pretty much continues as before, albeit without that potential cliff edge at the end of June. So we've still got the value of the furlough grant up to 80%, £2,500 a month. There is still, I'm afraid, the requirement that if you're on furlough, you cannot do any work. There's no flexibility on that until the 1st of August. There is still obviously the ability to put people on, put people off, rotate people through furlough, albeit with the requirement that any period of furlough must be for a minimum of 3 weeks. Once you've completed the 3 weeks, then you can pretty much do what you want. But any period of furlough must be a minimum of 3 weeks for you to qualify for the grant. What is going to change is really from the 1st of August, which is the introduction of, and I mean, an important point to make about Rishi Sunak's announcement on Tuesday, how short it was. It was less than 2 minutes. So the amount of detail we've got is even less than what we got when he announced furlough in the first place on the 20th of March. We actually know very little. As always, there's a lot of speculation about what he might be intending in terms of the detail, but we don't actually know. So he talked about part-time furlough. We don't quite know what part-time furlough is. He also talked about the introduction of an employer contribution. He did confirm that there was going to be no reduction in the amount that the individual might receive, but the government contribution to that would start to go down. I don't think, he said, down from 80% to 60%, but certainly 60% is the amount that's been widely canvassed in some of the publicity around this, and it could be that there's then a further tapering down. So potentially, and we won't know the detail until the end of May, but potentially from the 1st of August, there will be an employer contribution. It may be 20%, it might be less, it might be more, but there is the expectation of an enhanced employer contribution. So I think for many employers, once we get towards August and you've still got people on furlough, I think that's going to make it more likely then that people will start to revisit their plans. Not to say, of course, you might not want to revisit your plans sooner than that, but we'll come to that a little bit later. Next slide, please, Omar. Just to keep aware, there is other guidance out there as well, which is useful, and we will, in the guidance that we're going to be producing, be sort of citing more of it, because a lot of it is really on the theme of going to work and going back to work. There's been long-standing guidance around apprenticeships, really designed to keep apprentices in training and in employment, and there'll be more of that to come, both from ECA and I believe from the government. Obviously, that guidance that I cite there from the 24th of April is for England. There's similar guidance for Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, which we already cite in our existing guidance on the website. A reinforcement this week from the government. They're really quite keen for more people to take up the option of sending their kids to school. So in parallel with the plans to start reopening primary schools from the beginning of June. They are asking people to reconsider whether maybe they could claim that they are essential workers, they are critical workers. And if you recall, although construction, although electricians, plumbers, and so on aren't listed as critical occupations, we do work in critical sectors. Some of the critical sectors mentioned in that school's guidance: health and social care, food production, food processing, defence, prisons, transport, oil, gas, utilities, data infrastructure, nuclear, chemicals, and telecoms. So there is potentially, if you or your employees want to use it, there is potential there to cite the sort of work you do rather than necessarily the occupation you hold. Additional guidance issued on the 11th of May about staying safe outside of your home. There's quite a lot of good stuff there, well worth seeing, and it will be stuff I know that Paul will be echoing in some of the working safe guidance. But talk about working side to side or standing side to side rather than face to face, minimising the number of contacts, shift working, rotas, working in small teams, travel arrangements, staggered hours to avoid the rush hour, extra bike storage, extra car parking, changing facilities, washing clothes, ventilation, face coverings. There's a lot of stuff in there which, although it's generic guidance for staying safe outside your home, is of relevance to employers and to employees. Getting tested. Of course, we're aware that in the last couple of weeks it was confirmed that all those who cannot work at home and are showing symptoms are entitled to get a test alongside essential workers. Again, that's something which increasingly, as we see a greater return to work, one would imagine that individuals and employers would want to make more of. And also, a couple of days ago on the 12th of May, further safer travelling guidance for passengers, really building on some of that general travel guidance that I mentioned in the context of staying safe outside your home. All of that government guidance is out there on the web. We will, if we haven't already, be making it very easy for you to find the links for that on our web pages. And it's all useful stuff, particularly now as you're being put in a position where more and more you need to be communicating to employees. The safeguards are in place. They will be asking you questions about transport. They will be asking you questions about testing. The information is all there. All of it, as I said, from a political point of view, from a psychological point of view, nudging us towards getting back to work if we're not already back at work. Next slide, please, Omar. I've already mentioned the issue of Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland, and we do need increasingly to take account of the similarities as well as the differences, or rather the differences as well as the similarities. I mean, basically the situation we have in the nations is a greater continuity with what we had before. And we don't yet have recovery plans in the same way for England as we have for England in some of the other nations. I mean, Northern Ireland have come up with a 5-stage recovery plan rather than the 3 stages that Boris Johnson talks about, but there are no fixed dates. Wales, we're expecting one later this week, and likewise Scotland are holding back on the basis that they don't want to give people a signal which will then lead to people breaching the controls that are already in place. An important point, and something that I think is becoming increasingly apparent, is the amount of pressure there now is on Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland to not fall too far behind England in terms of a return. And I think one of the principal drivers there is furlough. That chronology of a change at the end of July in terms of employers starting to have to make a contribution, that does put pressure on the other nations to ensure that employers are going to be in a position to do that. So I think that pressure is going to be felt more and more as we move towards June and then towards July. Next slide, please, Omar. Okay, in terms of the implications of all of this for the industry, and for ECA and on our members, on the health and safety side, clearly there's a lot of new guidance out there. And so things like the CLC site operating procedures are probably going to need a refresh. And Paul might mention certainly the brilliant guidance that ECA and BESA put out a couple of weeks ago on close proximity working. I dare say that's probably, well, that is definitely going to need a relook based on what we've got now. On the commercial side, Rob's going to talk much more about some of the responsible contractual behaviour guidance, contractual best practice guidance that's been issued in the last few weeks. On employee relations, we will be making representations between now and the end of May to try and influence what part-time furlough means. We are looking to maximise coverage to ensure that it takes into account not just people who are salaried, but also people who are not salaried, people who are office-based, but also people who aren't office-based. And if you think about the detail about how the sort of a variety of arrangements that might arise where people aren't necessarily working fully productively, aren't necessarily working to their full earning capacity. It's a lot more complicated than just somebody saying, oh, I'll come in 3 days a week rather than 5. That might work in certain businesses with certain type of people. It's not really something that works for those who are hourly paid and on site. On skills, apprentices, recruitment and retention, concerns starting to be expressed about the scope for apprentices to return to work and what companies are thinking about in terms of the recruitment cycle that's taking place, that should normally take place in the summer and the autumn. Some encouraging indications from the Working Safely guidance. There looks like there could be some ways through on apprentices working safely. So that's something which we will be building up upon over the next few weeks, and obviously broader member guidance. Next slide, please, Omar. This is my penultimate slide, just to give you a little bit of a teaser, a little bit of a flavour of on the employee relations side. We are sort of absorbing all that's happened over the last week. We're putting together, finalising some going back to work FAQs. So those will go on the website early next week. We're also having to look at updating the other guides. As I said at the beginning, it's not just we're not replacing one regime with another. We've just got a new regime coming on alongside all the existing regimes, and so we're still having to manage people who are off sick. We're still having to manage people who are on furlough. We're still now increasingly having to manage people who are returning to work. So we'll be updating all of those. Our alternatives to furlough guide, I think we're probably going to rebadge that as moving away from furlough, and there will be a need at some point to provide redundancy and redundancy consultation guidance. We recognise that that might be an unavoidable option, and that's something that we're working on at the moment. So that will start to appear on the website from early next week, and we will sort of progress those as fast as we can. Final slide from me, Omar. Obviously, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions at the end, and there may be specific questions you've got. But we are looking for feedback as well on the sorts of questions that would be helpful in terms of the going back to work FAQs, bringing employees back, some of the issues there around selection of people, around resistance to being defurloughed or unfurloughed. I mean, those raise all sorts of issues because, of course, individual circumstances may vary. So you might want to take a different approach where somebody is shielding, where somebody has ongoing childcare responsibilities, as opposed, of course, to somebody who just doesn't want to come back to work. In terms of communicating changes, making changes, some of them are fairly minor, so it's simply a communications exercise. There might be others, such as additional safety measures that are in place to guard against COVID. Changes to terms and conditions where you really need to be looking at consultation, or in terms of changing terms and conditions, really at agreement with the employee. Obviously, as ECA, we're continuing our discussions with the Unite Union around making the JIB terms and conditions, for those of you who are JIB members, as flexible as possible. And the issue of shift premia has cropped up in those discussions. There will be more shift working going forward, and so that's something that we're talking to the trade union about at the moment. I think probably that's enough from me for now. There will be obviously a chance to answer questions at the end. I'll look at the questions that have been asked in the meantime, but I'll hand over now to Rob to talk about some of the very important commercial developments that have occurred over the last couple of weeks, and which of course he's been very closely involved. So over to you, Rob.
Thank you. Okay, over to me to be as comprehensive as Andrew. Omar, can you move me to the next slide? So what I'm going to try and do is take you through a recap of a fairly detailed contractual webinar that myself and Ruth Wilkinson from Clark's Legal gave around early April. And it's worth going back and having a look at that if you need to. It's listed as part 1 on our webinars list. It complements the download we've got on our website, which points to contractual guidance. And although they were released at the early stages of lockdown, there's a continuity theme as I go through this, which points out that coronavirus happened, it delayed things, it slows down productivity, even if you continue to work. And therefore, somebody has to pick up both the time and cost consequences of that. And that's what this is all about. So let's recap first, and we'll have a look at some of the economic pointers as well as we go. Number 1 is that I came to you on 2 or 3 webinars and told you about the conditions for site continuation. And as Andrew said, I'll put England on this slide, but Northern Ireland broadly followed this, and Wales had a slightly different set of guidance, but it still said work can continue. But that was subject to 4 things. 1 was Public Health England guidance. Secondly, which has now changed, it's also subject to one of the new government documents, which is working safely during coronavirus, construction and other outdoor work. The third point, which has not changed, was it was subject to general health and safety requirements. And we have a document on our website which walks you through your duties as an employer, like the Health and Safety at Work Act, corporate homicide, those kinds of issues to consider. And then I think fourthly, you've got to carry it out under the site operating procedures. Currently we're on version 3, and we'll let Paul pick up whether we are likely to see a version 4 or not. And then finally, workers can travel safely and responsibly to and from work, which has become more of an issue in the densely populated cities, particularly London, because of the nature of public transport, the availability of parking when guidance might recommend that you travel in your own vehicle, that kind of stuff. Next slide, please, Emma. So I'm just going to highlight, and Paul can pick up on the different documents that have come out this week in terms of safety. I'm not a safety specialist, but what happens with guidance at the moment, and I was asked this question again this morning, is the guidance law? No, it's not. And guidance is usually highly persuasive status in a court or tribunal. However, because so much is not known about coronavirus, pretty much all we've got at the moment is guidance, and therefore guidance is being taken as conclusive, and it is a very brave person or business that steps away from guidance without full risk assessment, evidence, audit trail to back up why they made a decision which in hindsight might have sought to deviate or stray from the guidance in any sense. But the 4 areas that might relate to our industry: construction and other outside areas. Footnote, construction, a hell of a lot of that activity and FM happens inside areas, inside buildings after the shell has been built. So we're not sure how that will work when it comes to the M&E sector. Secondly, safe working in homes, safe working in offices, is third, and safe working in factories and manufacturing is fourth. I mentioned those other ones because you've got different members working in the domestic consumer sector. Others have contacted me with inquiries where they manufacture the panels before they go and install, so they are design, supply and install, including the manufacturing. Omar, next slide please. Economics. So I need to point out first, this is the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, an independent body which oversees the budget, and this was early April. So in theory, it's a bit out of date. Next, it is just one model, but this is just one model of the OBR's view of things. But what I thought is worth pointing out is when we talk about recessions, and there was a webinar with Martin Hughes and Andrew and I on these things, towards the right there, I believe it's shaded, you can see the scenario plan based on the policy initiatives released at the time in I think it was the 9th of April. They expected a crash. That crash supersedes everything experienced before, even in the world wars. And then they expected it to bounce back to normal and continue in a kind of a fairly stable trajectory. That is very debatable because I don't think, certainly in our area, that encompasses the view now that some level of coronavirus is here to stay. And I know that's subjective and changeable day by day. But certainly that ongoing productivity rates on site due to safety issues which will be introduced will be impacted, and that will differ from trade to trade, task to task. However, that dictates the level of growth economically, and that will therefore be slower. If we move to the next slide, you'll see the net impact of what they believe the crash looks like. And the blue horizontal line there highlights that the fall in construction was one of the worst predicted in the economies. Now, generally, that didn't surprise me because construction tends to lag 9 months behind the front end of the economy, with the last ones to go into recession, with the first ones to come, and the last ones to come out. Because we are under contracts which were entered into some time ago to complete works. They were done on those prices, and variations to those contracts will be priced on those prices. It's the contracts you enter into now during the middle of the crisis that won't be started yet, that when they will start, you will be stuck in for the duration of that contract, which may be extended by variation, which might stick you to bad prices. And that's how the economic lag works, and almost becomes a penalty to the way the construction economy works. But if we can move on. Thanks, Omar. Just to recap what we covered in the last contractual webinar between Ruth and I. So we recommended that you do some kind of audit of the business, cover off where you get your materials from. Can you supply different types of materials to the ones previously asked for? You could look at the spec. Is it equal or approved? Is it a generic description of the type of product, or is it specific model and make? Check your variations clauses or change provisions. Check how delays work under the contract. How are you going to secure your labour? And I understand from talking to some contractors that they've managed to cope by, let's say, minimising the agency labour they used to take and securing the stability of the directly employed labour. Checking the money system. In other words, those contracts that I refer to that you're already in, they will have a cash flow window. That could be anything from 35 days after application to 90 or 120 days, depending on what you've chosen individually to accept. That will become horrifically longer in terms of securing cash flow and getting it in the door, and facing all the excuses that we traditionally get for late or non-payment or lower valuations, which, let's face it, will be more prolific as people seek to hold on to cash. we asked you to look at his suspension and termination provisions, because at that time we were getting reports of contractual bullying, and we asked people to look at evidence and future proofing their claims post COVID-19. So it was good to know that the feedback was negative, so that we could then try and do something about it. From a technical legal perspective, we tried to explain to you what frustration was and what force majeure was. We're not going to go into those explanations in any great detail. This is just a recap. They weren't that helpful to you. Frustration would kill the contract and you wouldn't be able to claim any losses. Force majeure only works if you've got a clause, and then you need to check what the clause actually lets you do. Generally, force majeure gives you time but not money. We walked you through the relevant clauses in great detail on JCT, where relevant events get you time and relevant matters get you money, loss and expense claims. NEC has a compensation event regime, and we took you through those and which ones you should look at, whether they are relevant. However, we also explained to you that you will always be under duty to minimise the loss you incur as a result, even if you're making claims, and that's your duty to mitigate. And then to watch out for notice and conditions precedent. So they are those clauses which say you only have a right to time or money if you've first done this. You need to check that you've done this before you start to make your claims. And we saw a lot of people communicating by text, WhatsApp and other devices, which were not valid contractual correspondence or notices. We mentioned time bars under things like NEC and lots of bespoke contracts. If you don't manage your contract, send the notices within 8 weeks, you're barred from doing so. Oh, one of my words is cut off there. And we pointed towards the PPNs, which are the policy procurement notes for public sector work, and that you should check your position with your insurers. I'm on next slide. So in terms of where we were before, we kind of said to you, look, what you want to do is confirm that you want to comply with these requests when people are shouting at you. You want to do your contractual works and carry on as a business delivering to clients who you've had a successful relationship with. But at the same time, you've got to leverage the contractual clauses and make sure you've sent the right paperwork. Lay the audit trail. You won't be able to claim anything unless there's evidence to back it up. You wanted to call their bluff slightly by requiring main contractors if you're a subcontractor, or making sure you've adapted your CDM and health and safety documentation to confirm that the site is safe. And that still remains the case. The point of SOPs, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, or the government guidance, as far as I'm concerned as a solicitor, is it plays a pivotal role in demarking that we or somebody has certified that the site is compliant, even in an FM or maintenance context, and therefore we are free to continue our activities. Moving on. Right, so give you the updates, the activities that have happened since that early April. So 11th of March we had lockdown. 15th of March we had PPN 01/20. That is a policy procurement note that tells civil servants in procurement authorities that they can more or less ignore the public sector procurement rules. Procurement lawyers will hate me for saying that. They relaxed the regime so they could get on and do things. The 20th of March, PPN 02/20. That was supplier relief, i.e. payment and trying to speed up things to make sure supply chains did not collapse. And then quickly after that, we had how you apply that PPN to construction, which also came out of government. And to explain what PPNs are, Cabinet Office and Crown Commercial Services are the body within central government which dictate the rules, except they cannot dictate to public sector procurement authorities what happens, because that would constitute abuse of a dominant position and anti-competitive behaviour. So they issue PPNs, and each part of local, central and other government bodies is supposed to read them and take notice of them. The reality is they don't necessarily trickle through that fast. So when it's in your interests, you might want to have a conversation with the public sector authority, or even indirectly with your employer that is employed by the public sector authority, drawing their attention to these kinds of documents and saying, how best can we work with you to make sure you continue successfully? Because at the moment it's not working for us, and therefore we don't believe it's working for you. On the 7th of May, government issued 2 things, and that was a culmination of a lot of work by various law firms that specialise in construction FM work, trade bodies, and it was led by ECA, who sit on the Construction Leadership Council COVID-19 Task Force. Underneath the task force are various work streams. We had highlighted the difficulty in the market as contractors geared up for a kind of civil war, whereby everybody started to look to make claims, and that's a macroeconomic level that would only do one thing: push risk downstream, lead to mass scale insolvency, a shortage of supply, and therefore the price would go up in terms of the level of demand left over. CLC acknowledged the issue. As with all these things, do something about it. ECA led a work stream to come up with something that would try and curb the behaviour, the negative behaviour. So there are two or three outputs that came out on the 7th of May. 2 are documents that we highlight there. The first one is working with Cabinet Office and other government departments to produce, or help them produce, the government guidance on responsible contractual behaviour. And secondly, the industry's response to what responsible contractual behaviour in construction and FM looks like, because the first one was generic across all business sectors. I mentioned 3 outputs. There is a survey going on asking everybody in industry, from funders, purchasers, tenants, developers, tier 1 contractors, 2, 3, 4 suppliers, everybody else, to input their view of the world from a contractual perspective, and kind of what standard forms or amended standard forms. Do you ever see an unamended standard form? That data can then be used to steer the direction of the next steps. So please fill in that survey if you see it. I know I've posted it on LinkedIn a couple of times for people to reshare and fill in. So going back to the documents. Next slide, please, Emma. The Cabinet Office guidance. It applies to public and private sector. It doesn't apply to the devolved administrations, because procurement is a devolved area. It applies with immediate effect and lasts till the end of June, but finishes with further measures will be contemplated if necessary. And we can think about what that might be. That politically, as a comment from the sidelines, Britain tends to go light touch before it can justify going any harder from a government perspective. I'll say no more on that. It complements existing arrangements, so it doesn't cut across the policy procurement notes that are referred to. It doesn't undermine the law itself. It simply tries to encourage businesses to do the right thing. Its objectives in life are to protect health, jobs and the economy, to ensure cash flow, wages and supply chain are protected, to avoid disputes and insolvencies on a scale which would cripple the economy. On the right hand side there you can see a quote: responsible and fair behaviour in performing and enforcing contracts where there has been a material impact from COVID-19. as you read through the rest of that, I'm not going to read it out in full. It is safe to say that that reflects exactly the philosophy that we fed into the civil servants, that your contracts have been and will continue to be materially affected from both a time and cost perspective, and therefore we needed leadership in order to pull commercial behaviour in a certain direction. Next slide. So the areas that document covers, and it's only a 5-page document, worth a read if you're looking for bedtime reading. It covers that flexibility, that responsible contractual behaviour by all parties, should apply to the scope of the contract, delivery, impaired performance, payment performance mechanisms, time and money issues, LADs, suspension and termination, leveraging security like bonds, guarantees, sending people into insolvency, consents, variations, notices, records, claims and dispute resolution. Now, rather than just reading a list, what's that covering? That's covering many items that we covered in our early April webinar, where we said you need to look out for these issues, making sure that you send the right notices on time in the right method by the right form, making sure that if you need to officially vary the contract, that conversation happens within the contract, making sure that you fend off LADs by getting the right extension of time, etc. So the philosophy is that everybody acts sensibly and responsibly. Forgive me for the background noise, there's construction happening outside. Next slide, please. So the next document, if that was a call to arms by the Cabinet Office on behalf of the entire public sector, certainly in England, and a call to arms for both private as well as public sector work to act fairly and responsibly, what came back from CLC? The group that ECA led can broadly, the philosophy can broadly be summarised as hope for the best but prepare for the worst. But it asks for concurrent conversations to occur. It advises people in very practical terms through what is quite a very technically in-depth legal area, that what you should be doing is operating the contractual machinery and having a commercial settlement conversation concurrently. You can send your notices under the contract. You can do all the things that might appear aggressive, but take the emotion out of the correspondence and simply refer to the clauses, etc. Whilst also saying, but on the other hand, let's have a conversation, sit around the table and hammer this out. As I said, ECA led the group, facilitated by our CEO, had 3 specialist law firms who were involved, which was a much broader technical input than anything that had gone before from CLC. And bear in mind that CLC, I think on the 8th of April, released a letter asking industry to play nice in respect of payment and contractual behaviour. So this was a step beyond that. It endorsed some contractual guidance from Build UK produced by a single law firm. This was a step beyond because it involved 3 specialist law firms who would ordinarily compete, 2 supply chain organisations, that was ECA, and we brought in BISA's legal team to support us in that. We had clients, consultants, consulting quantity surveying professional bodies. We had public sector and private sector clients and tier 1 who of a household name, but they may not wish to be publicised on this webinar. It applies to the public and the private sector, construction and FM. We know a lot of you operate in maintenance and the FM sectors. We made sure the document covered you as well. And again, it's a call to arms, and it's a call to funders, tenants, purchasers, developers, and everybody listed there to have a broader conversation. Next slide, please. it starts to get very practical. If government rhetoric, i.e. the Cabinet Office notes, it talks in theory, philosophy, the CLC's response was trying to translate and transpose that into practical measures. So rather than just telling you to have two concurrent conversations, one about contractual issues and one about commercial issues, it starts to tell you the how you do that. It highlights the objectives really is that you should be talking about new safety measures, how productivity is impacted, resource availability, your materials and your labour, business support measures that you're already taking advantage of, furlough schemes, CBILS, coronavirus business interruptions loan, bounce back loans, those kinds of things. This requires a level of honesty which we don't traditionally do in construction. It would require you to talk on a fairly open book basis about your additional costs, to highlight what mitigation measures you put in place. I talked earlier about the duty to mitigate, which appears in contracts, to minimise the loss you are incurring as a result of COVID-19. And what have you done about it? Contract management. It requires you to consistently have those project management meetings, site management meetings, even if it's now at a distance or remote digitally enabled meetings, to manage the programme and the costs in a consistent way. It also requires you to have a look at the alternative, i.e. if you can't hammer out a deal, and I'm saying this as an experienced mediator, where we've always reached a settlement on every mediation I've been involved with since 2006. Usually the central driver is no deal, let's go to court or adjudication. We'll go through those formal dispute resolution processes. It will cost us each a bundle of money, hiring the biggest gun lawyer we can afford to face off against each other with no definite chance of success. As a solicitor, I can tell you that in private practice, we would never, for PI insurance reasons, guarantee your success. We would list a whole series of factors which outlined what the variables were and what the assumptions were, which avoided the question of what are my chances of success. Next slide, please. So when you weigh up the alternatives of reaching a deal, you end up in perhaps 18 months worth of litigation and a whole series of costs which aren't worth taking a case for anything less than, say, 40, 50, 60 grand through the court system for. So a deal becomes much more appealing, even if you've got to take a hit. So the other thing this guidance from CLC highlights is that record keeping and notices and audit trails are far more effective and persuasive at hammering out a deal. It is very hard to argue with somebody that's got something in black and white in front of them that forensically links the loss to the cause, i.e. COVID-19. It becomes very, very convincing whether you're in a mediation, a courtroom, or simply a kind of remote commercial negotiation. When you fight emotionally, it doesn't work. When you fight based on facts and figures, it does work. So the document then goes on to say, well, what can you do about it? There's a chance here to think imaginatively. You could look at, so you move from highlighting problems through to evidence, audit and paperwork. And then you move to the final stage really, which is CLC guidance then recommends we start to think imaginatively about solutions. What could go in the deal to make this palatable to both parties? Deals, people are never happy with deals, but they reflect what people can live with. So payment could finish in accelerated frequency of payment, project bank accounts, a secure payment from insolvency within the supply chain. You could advance payment. You could identify that, hey, look, we've got either bespoke kit or huge chunks of kit, or we've got large volumes of kit. Pay me up front for that. I'll give you a piece of paper saying it's yours, belongs to you, it's insured, it's labelled yours, or else you could buy it direct and we'll just install it. Whichever way you want to do it, it secures our cash flow model on this project and secures their position in terms of successful project delivery. And you could even change although we have an addiction to lump sum cost contracts, i.e. fixed price, you could change the nature of the pricing to target. In other words, if we go over, we both share the pain in certain percentages. The document then walks through what is called without prejudice subject to contract, and that is really the legal label we give to correspondence and meetings, which cannot be reproduced in court to indicate guilt. In other words, if we label the negotiations under this heading, and they genuinely are, we can make sure we can talk freely in a safe legal space to say, well, what if I do this? Will you accept that? In my mediations, they are always carried out without prejudice, subject to contract and confidentially. It means that whatever was said in the mediation cannot be exposed in court. Then rather helpfully at the end of the document, you've got annexes where, due to the technical experts from the private practice firms and then the in-house expertise, making sure that was usable within a contractors, consultants and developers context, you have annexes 1 and 2, which outline letters that could be used to open up the commercial dialogue and the collaborative conversation. Annexes 3, pardon me, which deals with letters that can be used with respect to JCT, and 4 on NEC. It's worth pointing out here that the obvious gripe will be they cite the main contracts. What about us subcontracts? It's no big deal to get one of the main contracts out along with the sub and check the clause numbers. That's really all the exercise is, to make sure they're transposed. The equivalent clauses will be there. It's just making sure you got the clause numbers right when you adapt it for a subcontract relationship. Probably the bigger health warning is check amendments, because my experience of dealing with over the last 10 years, we've had an audience of nearly 4,000 contractors operating at tier 1, 2 and 3 across domestic, consumer, commercial and FM jobs. It is on a handful of times per year that we see standard form contracts unamended. They're usually butchered JCTs, NECs or bespokes, and therefore you're going to have to adapt these templates to suit. And the biggest mistake we see as lawyers is copy, paste, send without adaptation. Everybody's going to be also impacted by other agreements, whether it's you using labour and your subcontractors or that kind of thing, or your client, the main contractor, looking at what they've signed up to under the main contract, the development agreement, the funders agreements, those kinds of things. The document walks you through dispute resolution, which is really a warning to say, if you go down that other road of not being able to reach a deal, you will end up in either litigation, arbitration, adjudication, which might be the quick and cheap version of the other two. But either way, it will cost you money in lawyers. So it's name checks 3 initiatives that have come out recently. If you can move on to the next slide. Which are that the CLC have endorsed the RICS Dispute Avoidance Pledge and CIC Low Cost Adjudication System. It also talks about mediation as a fast, cheap, confidential means of dispute resolution. In my experience as a mediator, it tends to be that we are there because the parties have been unable to hammer out a mediation a settlement agreement to the contract. And broadly, what you're trying to do here is fix a deed of variation, which is a document which simply records what you've shaken hands on, how the insurance issues, if any, the pricing mechanism, the valuation mechanism, extensions of time, loss and expense, aka compensation events under the contract, have changed. Your joint conversation recognising that COVID-19 has had an impact, but here's how you're going to agree to take the hit. It can't be one-sided. That's why the Cabinet Office came out with their draw on it, because one-sided conversations or no conversations will simply lead to risk going down, people going bust, project delivery being compromised, economy being compromised. So this is seen as I said, the more responsible way to behave. I thought I'd finish on, well, I've talked a lot about philosophy, ethos, what happens next, how do you use these? And the contractual and commercial conversations do need to be had concurrently, because your worst case scenario is the commercial conversation goes nowhere and you're left to only have the legal one, which is going to cost you money and time, but that there will be cases where your clients refuse to have any other type of conversation. As I said, make sure you adapt the templates and make sure you have evidence in terms of record keeping and notices to back it up. How do you use these documents if they're not binding, if they're only guidance? Well, the Cabinet Office one should help everybody because it's a call to arms. If it gets ignored, in the public sector, it should be highly persuasive. In the private sector, it may be less so. But certainly, whether you need to write to your MP, whichever way you can use this, it may be non-binding, but it has small p political leverage in commercial relations, in embarrassing people from a PR perspective, and along a number of lines like that. The CLC document should act as a checklist. If you read it once or twice and get your head around it, because it's not necessarily an easy read, it should give you the practical considerations and the templates that can help you have the start of this conversation towards hammering out the deal. It actually points to everything that's gone before through hyperlinks, which I put in, including the PPN 0220, which then contains a template as to how you record that conversation in a settlement agreement. So we pulled all this together because we recognised at the start of April, when we gave that first webinar, which I recapped over, that the situation was going down fast. And it wouldn't be good for ECA members or industry at large. And CLC agreed with us. So where we are now is that we've got some pointers, and that was to deal with the immediate crisis. The group hasn't finished its work. That is the first stage. The survey will steer the group in the next direction, and we'll sit down together, talk about that, and talk about what happens next. And obviously, a key feature of that is how you future-proof contracts. But I really wanted to say thank you to all those that have helped us out on this in the wider industry and within the ECA membership, because that help really does plug in directly to the conversations we're having with people at the very highest level. I apologise that these two documents weren't out earlier, but quite frankly, they were in a holding pattern for release from Downing Street at the very top for about 10 days. So the work was done. And before, I'll let Paul take the slot now and then come back to you at Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Thanks, everyone. I've noticed there are some health and safety related questions. I'm just going to provide very brief highlights, if we can call them highlights, of what's happened this week in terms of the guidance that's been issued that both Andrew and Rob have already mentioned. Won't take very long. It won't be a complete review of everything that's been said in that guidance. I'm trying to pick out the things that have changed, that are new and important, of which there are some. And they will, I hope, address some of the questions that are coming through. So what happened this week on Monday is that the government issued some guidance on how to work safely on construction and outdoor sites and various other locations, including manufacturing locations, offices, domestic settings, and in vehicles. And I'll talk about a couple of those things in a moment. It's pretty clear from the guides that in general, they're all saying the same thing. In other words, there's a general set of safety related principles to which all these guides are working. They don't vary greatly in content from one guide to another, but they are then looking at specific issues. So, for example, there would be some specific site advice, there'll be some specific vehicles advice, and some specific domestic working advice. Can't go into all those things today. What I would say is that all these things are summarised on the ECA's coronavirus webpage, in headline at the moment, but in more detail as we go in the coming days. So please feel free. And if you've got any questions specifically and you're an ECA member, you're very welcome to ring us for specific advice. But what's new and different? I'm talking about what's new and different really to the Construction Leadership Council's version 3 site operating procedures. Well, for those who have any familiarity with those documents, what's disappeared in the government's guidance, which is issued by BEIS, and I think the thing we have to see as a positive is that BEIS is saying that this guidance has been issued in consultation with Public Health England and HSE and the trades unions and various other bodies, including trade associations, employers. What this means is that this guidance has credibility. It has weight. It's government guidance, and we should pay a lot of attention to it. I think what it will do is it will require, although the Construction Leadership Council will decide on this, but it will require the CLC to update its SOP version 3 to a version 4, and I imagine they're working on that now. But what we've got is this guidance, and what it does is it removes references to something that was causing a big problem in the industry, which is in relation to close proximity working, a reference to working up to 15 minutes. There is no reference to 15 minutes in any of those guidance notes that came out this week. What it does say is that if you're going to do close proximity work, and I'll talk about that briefly in a moment, you do it for the shortest period of time possible. So there's no mention of 15 minutes. There's plenty said in there about respiratory protective equipment, and I've got a slide which I'd like to show you in a moment on that. There's much more useful guidance now on how you can work in vehicles, whether travelling to work or between work locations. I'll talk about that very briefly in a moment. And there is, interestingly, a requirement on larger businesses, those who employ over 50 people, to publish their risk assessments. I won't go into that in detail today, but obviously big companies will have to think exactly how they intend to do that. I'm sure there's a simple and effective route to doing that, but we've got to bottom it out. I imagine that means publishing something useful and indicative on company websites. In relation to close proximity work, it's clear from the current guidance that's been issued now by BEIS, as I say, with the support of HSE and PHE, at least we believe it's support because their name is in that guidance. Close proximity working should be exceptional. It is not meant to be the norm, but it is allowed. I'll come on to face coverings in a second. It is allowed, and if you introduce mitigating measures which are listed in the guidance in detail, then you can do it. Talking about the face coverings and masks, the BEIS guidance says that they're more interested in people wearing face coverings than they are in wearing tight-fitting masks or surgical masks. In fact, the guidance is very clear indeed. It doesn't want people to use tight-fitting masks or surgical masks to control coronavirus on construction sites or in domestic settings or in vehicles. It doesn't want that to happen. It explains why, but it's not at all advocated. If there's another hazard which is causing you to wear those things, clearly you continue to wear tight-fitting respiratory equipment like FFP3 and what have you. But it's not intended for use with coronavirus. What the guidance now says, all of it, is you may wear face coverings, and face coverings could, for example, include cloth or cotton masks, which are not tight-fitting, but which have some impact on taking out the exhalation risk, i.e. when you breathe out. Bearing in mind that some people may have coronavirus but not be showing symptoms, and they will still be working probably, and therefore these masks have some effect in protecting other people from viral infection at that stage in coronavirus. That's partly why they're being mentioned, if you like. But even there, if you read the guidance, I don't know if you would agree with me when you do, but the government's quite grudging in its acceptance that even you should be trying to wear face coverings. But it's saying you can do it, it's saying it's optional, and it's saying it's not required by law. So it says workers may additionally wear a face covering, but it's optional, not required by law. But they're not a replacement for other ways of mitigating the risk from coronavirus. So in terms of close proximity working, you've got to try and do the other things. The other things include hand washing, surface cleaning, all the things that we already know about, but absolutely do those things. keeping activity times short, using fixed teams or partnering. Now that applies to construction sites of close proximity work, it applies to travel in vehicles, and I'll talk about vehicles in just a second. But you can see here from this slide on face coverings and masks, the guidance is showing us that if we want to wear these things, and I know many of us do, and I know workers sometimes want these things as well, it's face coverings, not tight-fitting masks, which we should be looking at. Okay, I'll move on, Omar, to the next slide. Vehicles and close proximity. Now, I've taken this from the vehicles guidance, which came out with all the other guidance at the beginning of the week. Where social distancing can't be followed, in other words, where closer proximity is required, and we all know that that's quite common in smaller vans, there are a range of mitigating actions which are available to you. It's quite a list, but they're there. What I'd take from that list, which obviously I won't try and talk to in detail today, but it means that there are ways forward. It's clear that the government is saying you can travel together in vans, and there are things you need to do though to ensure that. Interestingly, they do not say use face coverings as one of the mitigating measures, but what they do is say, it's an option, and it's at the end of the list of things that they do say, and that's what's shown here. So, reduce the amount of travelling time. This important thing about if you are going to team up or have groups of people, the bit that's going to be difficult for you is if all these people are different people every day. What the government is saying is really try hard to come up with fixed pairs of people or fixed teams or partnering or buddying or whatever you want to call it. That will reduce the risk of spread of coronavirus. And there's other mentions there, and some of the people asking questions today have mentioned them too. Obviously, opening a window, that's not a tough one. I'm sure most of us can do that one as an increased ventilation technique. These screens, by the way, please don't think we're talking about hard perspex screens like they're trying to fit in taxis and things. That would be daft on some of our things. But there are some flexible plastic screens which basically hang down, a bit like tent fabric really, and they have some shielding effect. But you can use masks, not masks rather, you can use face coverings if you so choose. And if your risk assessment leads you there, then that's not a problem. So I'm only trying to give those highlights today. All this information and all the background to it is on the ECA's coronavirus website. And we're happy to help members, and we will be issuing specific guidance in these areas very shortly. Thank you, Omar.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you very much to our presenters today, helping everyone digest some very complex topics, certainly a huge volume that have come through this week. Now, to everyone on the panel, before I dive into the questions, I see you've been reading them and answering them in written form as we've been going along. Before we dive in, we have run over our allotted hour slightly. However, this whole session will be recorded and we will make it available to watch back on our YouTube channel, and this will include the full Q&A session, which we are now going to spend a few minutes addressing. So I'll start with Andrew. Are there any questions you've seen that you'd like to highlight in particular?
I think that they're mostly familiar. I think probably the one that I would highlight is the question that was raised around reluctance or even resistance from employees to return to work, and what do we do about it? And I think what I advised is proceed with caution, get to the bottom of why it is that the person you're talking to has a problem with it. I mean, clearly, if you've got a choice into who you select to return to work and you're still keeping some people on furlough, then it probably helps to do a bit of prior analysis. Those who've got health issues, I think it's really very difficult at the moment for you legitimately to require people who've got genuine health concerns, certainly people who are shielding and even other sort of health concerns to require them to go back to work unless there really are strong safeguards in place. For others, it could be childcare responsibilities. You might want to consider if you do have a limited number of spaces opening up to go back to work, inviting volunteers as one technique to minimise resistance. Ultimately, though, if you get down to the bottom of it, I mean, oh, sorry, before I get to the bottom of it, one other thing could be transport concerns. And so again, any assurances or guidance or information you can provide, not merely about the safeguards that are in place on site, but also any support you can offer with regard to travel options and so on, they're all grist to the mill. They're all helpful in bringing you and your employees to a point where it's probably going to be quite difficult for them to put up a rational justification for not returning to work. If, however, you get through all of that, you're satisfied and you've explained to them that there really aren't anything that they need be concerned about, then ultimately you can take sanctions. I mean, one of the suggestions that we have made in the past, and it's in the guidance on our website and on the detailed guidance as well, is you can say to somebody, well, you're not showing yourself to be willing to go to work. There's no obstacle for you going to work. This is an unreasonable refusal of you to attend work. Therefore, I am entitled as your employer to stop paying you. That really is a pretty drastic solution. You're effectively saying that you're on unpaid leave of absence. The other option is to take people down a disciplinary route. That's also fraught with difficulties. It might be more effective as a last resort to say you're off the clock. But as I said, hopefully it doesn't get to that point.
Thank you, Andrew. Rob or Paul, is there anything you'd like to add?
Rob, do you want to add anything?
I don't think so. I think at this stage everybody's mostly concerned about managing people who haven't been necessarily fully engaged, as Andrew's described. Obviously, feel free. In my conversations, even when we used to give conferences and everything else, I was quite used to the fact that people didn't want to talk about necessarily their dirty secrets in public. So feel free to get in contact with us via the help desk, and we'll try and help you through your issues. We will be uploading more and more templates to the website, which will help you adapt, tailor, and fit these to your situation as you go through the next couple of months.
Omar, just one from me, if I may then. So it's just to say that I've talked a little bit about working together in vehicles, and I can see the questions that have come in. People are very interested in that aspect. There will be 2 pages of guidance on the ECA website about this, probably by the end of today, which is drawn from the government guidance. And as I say, I think it gives us some routes towards allowing this sort of thing to happen, but it's obviously got to be done properly, and it does require risk assessment.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you once again to all our presenters and our viewers for joining us today. As I said earlier, the full recording of this session will be available on ECA's YouTube channel later on today, and the guidance that was referred to throughout the presentation will all be made available very shortly on ECA's dedicated coronavirus website, eca.co.uk/coronavirus. Do check back as often as you can to that page, because it is updated very regularly. And with that said, thank you everyone, and hope you have a wonderful day.